Cum clauses are a special group of subordinate clauses. As their name suggests, they are all introduced by the word cum. Remember that this word is both a preposition that has an ablative object and a conjunction. When there is not an ablative word nearby, this is a good clue you're reading a cum clause. Additionally, if the editor marks off a subordinate clause with commas, then you are also likely reading a cum clause. There are four kinds of cum clauses: temporal clauses, circumstantial clauses, causal clauses, and concessive clauses. If you remember the noun tempus temporis, you will remember that temporal clauses indicate when something happens. For example, at the time when the ship arrived at Ostia, the sailors rejoiced. Or just when the ship arrived at Ostia, the sailors rejoiced. Circumstantial clauses explain under what conditions the main action happened. For example, under the circumstances that the soldiers were safe, the families rejoiced. Or just, when the soldiers were safe, the families rejoiced. Causal clauses explain why something happened. For example, because the general conquered the barbarians, the soldiers returned home. Concessive clauses explain that although something hindered, obstructed, or opposed the action of the main clause, it still happened. For example, although the general was foolish, nevertheless he conquered the enemy. Two of these four clauses have distinctive features that help you recognize them. Of the four cum clauses, only the temporal clause has a subordinate indicative verb. The other three clauses, the circumstantial, causal, and concessive, all nicely starting with C, have a subordinate subjunctive verb. So, if your cum clause has an indicative verb, translate it according to the pattern when X happens, Y happens. You can identify the concessive cum clause by the word tamen in the main clause. This adverb means nevertheless and indicates that the subordinate and main clauses contain opposed actions. So if the subordinate clause starts with cum and the main clause contains tamen, translate it according to the pattern although X happens, nevertheless Y happens, or although X happens, Y happens. This leaves the causal and circumstantial clauses. When you determine that the sentence does not contain a temporal clause or a concessive clause, you're reading a causal or circumstantial clause. In order to determine which of the two you are reading, you must see which makes more sense. There is no one clear clue to differentiate the two. Does it make sense to follow the circumstantial pattern? Under the circumstances that X happens, Y happens, or the causal pattern, because X happens, Y happens. Let's look at an example to clarify all of these patterns. Cum dux dixisset milites ad urbem ad venerunt. Before we translate it, we need to know what type of cum clause it is. First, we know it is not a temporal clause because dixisset is subjunctive, so it must be either a circumstantial, causal, or concessive clause. Second, we know it is not a concessive clause because tamen is not present in the main clause. That leaves us with two options, circumstantial or causal. In order to determine which it is, we must look at context clues and translate the sentence to see which option makes more sense. According to the pattern for circumstantial clauses, it would read, under the circumstances that the leader had spoken, the soldiers arrived at the city. This translation implies that only after the leader spoke could the soldiers arrive at the city. According to the pattern for causal clauses, it would read, because the leader had spoken, the soldiers arrived at the city. This translation implies that the leader said something that made the soldiers go to the city. Without context clues, it is not 100% clear which of the two translations is preferable, and therefore whether it is a causal or circumstantial cum clause. This ambiguity is fairly common for isolated sentences, because context clues from surrounding sentences will be more helpful in clarifying the translation. Nevertheless, to me, the causal translation of this particular sentence makes a little more sense than the circumstantial translation. After all, armies usually respond to their leaders' commands instead of always patiently waiting for a speech before acting. So let's practice translating a cum clause. Cum milites fortes fuissent, tamen legio non vicet. First, how do we know it is a cum clause? We know it is a cum clause because the word cum begins a subordinate clause with the verb fuissent, and there is no clear ablative word dependent on the word cum within the subordinate clause. Second, what type of cum clause is in this sentence? Since the subordinate verb is subjunctive, and since the adverb tamen is present, we know it contains a concessive clause. So how do we translate this sentence? Although the soldiers were brave, nevertheless, the legion did not obtain victory. Or, although the soldiers were brave, the legion was not victorious. Or, although the soldiers were brave, the legion did not conquer.